You're listening to the Slavic Literature Pod, your shelf help guide to all things Slavic.
I'm Matt Gerasimovich, PhD candidate at Northwestern University, studying Russian literature and film.
And I'm Cameron Lalana, literature enthusiast and a guy working in media. We're two friends who met while studying in Russia. We like talking about books so much we made it into a podcast.
And this podcast is the podcast for people who want to learn more about Slavic literature, art, and culture. Every episode, we're going to be bringing you the background and analysis you'll need to know to understand these works.
If you're interested in supporting us, you can head on over to our website, slaviclitpod.com. All right, Matt, what are we getting into this week? And this is an episode long time coming.
Yes, through many, many months of me being bad at coordinating, we are finally very happy and honored, really, to have Philip Metris here to discuss his translation of Ochre Rust, New Selected Poems by Sergey Gandlevsky. Philip is a poet, scholar, translator, essayist, and peacebuilder. He's the author of 12 books, including Fugitive/Refuge, 2024, Ochre Rust, New Selected Poems of Sergey Gandlevsky, 2023, Shrapnel Maps, 2020, The Sound of Listening, Poetry as Refuge and Resistance, 2018, and Sand Opera, 2015. His work has garnered fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the Lannan Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Ohio Arts Council, and the Watson Foundation. He has been awarded the Adrienne Rich Award, 3 Arab American Book Awards, the Cleveland Arts Prize, and the Hunt Prize. Metris has been called one of the most essential poets of our time, whose work is beautiful, powerful, magnetically original. He is professor of English and director of the Peace, Justice, and Human Rights program at John Carroll University. He is also core faculty at Vermont College of Fine Arts. Philip, thank you so much for joining us today.
I'm absolutely thrilled to be joining you, so thank you for having me, yeah.
I also want to point out that Philip gave us like a little note in the books, which is not usually what happens, and I just want to say thank you for that again, because it's a nice touch. It's great. It was a fun little surprise to open that up and be like, wow, this is awesome. This is great.
Well, as you know, poetry sometimes needs a personal touch, so that's what we're about here, yeah.
So I'm curious, because I know for a fact that there are people in our audience who might be hearing about Sergey Gandlevsky for the first time. I was kind of wondering, just real broad strokes, if you might be able to kind of lay out for us where he fits in the cultural canon of Russian poetry, sort of who is Sergey Gandlevsky for the uninitiated?
Oh, sure. So Sergey Gandlevsky was born in 1952. So he was part of the post-Stalin generation and grew up, when he was a youth in the 70s and 80s, a time that was called the stagnation period. This was a period just after the thaw when there was this huge sort of flourishing of a momentary flourishing of sort of free speech and arts again in the 60s. People like Yevtushenko and Akhmadulina and Voznesensky, they were declaiming, they had these poetry readings in which they were declaiming to thousands, right? This is the stereotype of that thought period, right? Gandlevsky came right after that. So after all of that momentary sort of possibility, this opening that was happening, crashed because there were some political events that happened. There was suddenly, again, dissidents being jailed. There was the, invasions of Czechoslovakia and elsewhere. And so people stopped believing that there was a kind of liberalism that was possible. So Gandlevsky emerges at a moment of great cynicism, I think, in the culture and a sense of the failure of the Soviet project. He himself was born into a family that was really interesting. A father who was an engineer and Jewish, and a mother who came from a family that had a patriarch from the Russian church. So Gandlevsky famously says, or at least he said to me, and he's famous to me, that in Russia I was a Jew, but everywhere else I was a Russian, and because it was through his father's side that his Jewish background is. So he's sort of an outsider everywhere, and I think that self-characterization is totally classic for writers, but it's also very typical of him and his relationship to his own society. He was definitely passionate about and interested in a kind of writing that was opting out of society. So many of his generation of artists were not necessarily dissidents, but they were outsiders. They were inner emigres, they were opting out. He was a bohemian. He did all these wacky jobs. He was a night watchman. He worked on like trains and things like that. He was, our equivalent of a sort of beat poet, who basically said, the society is broken. I am not going to give my honor to it. I'm going to be sort of a bum. And so, although he had these incredible aspirations to a kind of nobility of poetry in life, he opted for opting out and not getting any of the potential goodies that one might get being in the society. So that's kind of the historical moment in which his writing and a personage kind of emerge.
I think at one point in your introduction, you described him as a vodka-infused bohemian or something along these lines. And I thought this is going to be a great selection of poems. I can't wait. Sounds right up my alley.
His drinking was prodigious, and in fact, even when I met him and we did some reading tours in the States, he would say, like, I'm not drinking anymore. I've finally quit. But sort of halfway through, things would take a turn. And I say that with all due respect for his great sense of discipline, but also the wildness that is part of his work, and the duality that's really embedded in his whole oeuvre. So I'll just give you one little anecdote about his prodigious drinking. He was supposed to be reading at a special festival event, and he wasn't there quite on time, and he finally shows up, and someone was asking him, I think it was like 5 o'clock in the afternoon, he's like, Sergey, where have you been? And he said, well, we were drinking until 3. He goes, 3 o'clock in the morning? He goes, no, just 3 o'clock p.m. And that's sort of like the world in which he existed. He's a sort of superhuman, a man who subsisted on vodka, basically, for a while.
That's interesting. That's funny. What's that awesome old comedian joke of like, I'm an expert at quitting smoking. I've quit like 1,000 times. Well, talking about Gandlevsky, for a lot of people who may not be familiar, we wanted to ask if you have a personal favorite or a poem that you think might be good to share if you're able to read it, and then kind of talk about what's so striking about the poetry, what draws you to it, and what might draw other people to it.
Oh, yeah, for sure. One of the interesting features of a lot of Russian poetry, particularly lyric poems, is that they don't have titles, and Gandlevsky follows in that tradition. So this is a poem that doesn't have a title, but the first line, which is what we often know poems by in Russian, is, it's time to change the record, but I'm dreaming again. And just in advance, one of the things that really drew me to Gandlevsky was his ability to capture something of ordinary life. A lot of times we think of poetry as about, love or, the ups and downs of the human heart. And it certainly is all of that. But one of the things that drew me instantly to him was this clarity of vision about ordinary life. And when I was living in Russia 30 years ago, back in 92 and 93, one of the things that I often did was take trains, the electric train, elektrichka, the metro in Moscow, constantly on public transportation. And you find a certain kind of ecosystem of life in public transportation, and he captures it in this poem. So it's time to change the record, but I'm dreaming of the motherland. Bored, shouldering past crowds at the station, I wait for the train since I intend to grow some apples or gooseberries. September's leaving. I dream that I'm just dreaming of crossing a wide country to nail some important scrap of board to a shed. Perspective of dreams is a dream within a dream within a dream. I smoke, squat down in a potato patch, burn off time, and over the muddy road I head home from my small dacha plot toward the train's plaintive cry. But damn, no matches, and it's bad luck to go back. So I knock at random doors along the way, matches, and a strange old woman leans through a low frame and blinks and mumbles as if she were to blame that the weather's bad and there's no smooth roads, that Saturday at the club the guys came to blows, that I wander the halls of the world like a fool, an unlit cigarette in this hard autumn wind, as if she were to blame for this and that and for the rest, for the troubles of the motherland.
I like that one too.
Oh, thanks.
I guess it's a different experience. As I was going through, I was reading these out loud to myself. It's a different experience to hear them being read by someone else.
For sure. And I've been subsisting on these poems for quite some time, so they're kind of in my blood a little bit. And the rhythms are really apparent once you hear something aloud too, which is, I think, one of the things I learned about poetry from Russian poetry, that the poem is only alive when it's heard, really. So I really wanted to capture something of the music of the original. Of course, it's a different music, but hopefully it's an analogous music to that original. The other thing that was really important for me in this poem was this figure of the woman, which is a recurrent kind of motif in Gandlevsky's work, his sense of having disappointed his mother on some level, and also the way in which that's related to a greater concept of the motherland, Rodina Mat, this sense of this place that that he has somehow failed on some level. And having seen so many old women in Russia, sweeping out metros and doing all manner of really, really difficult labor, that kind of image of a woman who's kind of suffering a little bit and just seemed so symbolic of something that I saw almost every day when I lived there.
I like this sort of like listless wandering figure. I don't know. It feels like it would encapsulate what it would have, in some sense felt like growing up. And I mean, it seems like it wouldn't have been a super fulfilling time to be growing up at a time that is then dubbed stagnation.
Oh, totally. There's a sense that time isn't money, actually. It's just time, and you're burning it. You're burning off time. Yeah, which is such a interesting phrase that comes out in here.
But you mentioned the music of the poem, and this is something that I grapple with a lot, even on this podcast. Like we kind of talked about a little bit before we got going, that we haven't really had a lot of success talking about a lot of poetry on the podcast, and part of that is because it's very difficult to discuss poetry in translation, and I think doubly so for Russian. Or I guess that's what I can speak to, because that's the other really language that I know. So that's where I can speak from some authority on what can be lost, or, what is this sort of incapturable quality about it. And I'm kind of curious how you grapple with that as a translator, because I know based on reading your introduction that you're very aware of this. And so I'm kind of curious if there were any changes or shifts in the way as you've kind of, grown and sat with these poems for a while, because this is your second book on Gandlevsky. So how have you started to approach maybe some of this translation in a little bit different of a way than maybe when you had first started or were first thinking about it?
Yeah, totally, Matt. I think what initially attracted me to the poems was that sense of a vision and a personage of someone who had sort of opted out of a society, and yet because of that outsider position was able to see it all the more clearly. That vision, that sense of humor, but also tragic observation, tragic conscience, really attracted me. Also the sort of bohemian rebelliousness as well. But as I started translating the work, I became more and more aware of the fact that his poems, and in fact almost every Russian poet that I can think of, brings together a vision with a sound, with a kind of incredible music that makes everything make sense. And that's the weird thing. Sometimes you'll read a poem in translation, you'll think, I don't understand how it's getting from point A to point B to point Z. But when it's all in this music, it all kind of comes together, with rhyme, with meter, with sonic connections. So as a translator, I felt a particular duty at first to translate the kind of vision of the work, the vision of the poem as it was unfolding, the images, right, the particular language. But as I kind of have moved through, I've become more and more attracted to the concept of the sonic analogy, the music. How can we kind of create a parallel music, which might mean at points to slightly diverge from the literal into something that kind of is closer to to the music. Um, so there's a lot of different ways that happens in a period of translation. For one thing, like I really wanted to, particularly with the second book, is revisit some of the translations I had done and try to become a little bit more regular in terms of my metrical choices, in terms of like amplifying some of the rhyme. I became less afraid of rhyme. For any of the listeners who might be aware of American poetry, rhyme was pretty out of fashion for quite a while. There are some poets now who rhyme pretty well, and certainly if you love hip hop, you love rhyme. But it was very out of fashion. So translating it at first, I wanted to avoid obvious rhymes and things like that. But I've become sort of fascinated by rhyme again. I've fallen back in love with it as a technique of music and poetry.
We've kind of gotten a little bit deeper in talking about, about why Gandlevsky or about, I guess more so how Gandlevsky. But I wanted to take it back a few steps. And there's so many, we've talked about many poets from this era of Russian, I guess more so Soviet poetry. But I wanted to ask, what drew you to Gandlevsky specifically? And then, what kind of not only drew you to liking Gandlevsky's poetry, but also to translating 2 volumes of it?
For sure. So I very luckily and happily received a fellowship to study Russian poetry and its relationship to historical change back in '92. It was from the Thomas Watson Foundation, which has this wonderful post-undergraduate program where you can spend a year on a particular project proposal. And I was really interested in Russian poetry. I was really interested in how poets are the sort of antennae or scribes of social change. And so I found a few connections here or there. Actually, I was doing some of my summer before I left at Northwestern, studying with a woman who was teaching in the Russian program there, Tatiana Tolchinsky, and just doing some Russian classes, just boning up on my Russian, which I studied in college. And she connected me with a translator and a writer named Dmitry Surtsev, whose work I've also translated. And he became my Virgil to the Russian inferno, such as it was in 1992, where he connected me to all these different poets. And so I interviewed a bunch of poets, and we spent a lot of time together as he sort of trained me in translation. And of all of them, Gandlevsky, for some of the aforementioned reasons, sort of really rose in my estimation. Plus, he was very urbane and kind and generous. Like, he had me over to his house. I ended up going to his dacha. He was just so cool. I don't know how to explain it, but some of the poets I met were kind of older. Some of them were kind of maybe a little strange. As poets can be. But Gandlevsky was just like, to me, the coolest guy, and the vision was something that I was utterly enchanted by, like enthralled by. So he's kind of tall. He smokes. He has a dog. A boxer. We're walking back from the metro where he picked me up. And we walk back, and he points out. He goes, "Oh, see that monastery there? It was on the roof of that monastery where we used to drink." I mean, like, he would just say stuff like all the time, and I was like, here I'm this kind of nerdy post undergraduate, kid, 22 years old, just utterly enthralled by the kind of majesty and wildness of this guy. Who's, probably around 40, I think, at that point. And so, it just captivated me. And the poems were just so rich. They were so kind of full and packed with allusions and wildness and classical beauty all at the same time. So there are many other poets that I got passionate about at that time that were from the contemporary scene. And I've translated, bits and pieces of them. And 2 others that I've published books with, Lev Rubinstein, who I feel very strongly about, and Arseny Tarkovsky, the father of Andrei Tarkovsky, the great filmmaker. I love those guys too, but Gandlevsky was like the one who announced himself as the one that I must translate.
That's awesome. So I'm just curious, this wasn't a prepared interview question, but what was it like being in Russia in '92? What a year to be there.
it was the beginning of that Wild West period.
Yeah.
So it was exciting on some level. Everything seemed possible, but it was also, for the older generation, really stressful and panic-inducing. Lots of people lost their lives, their life savings overnight. The month I arrived, the interest, the inflation rate went up. I think it was like 2,000%. I think that first month or something. So the economy was entering into a very rocky period, and that really impacted people's psychology. The desperation was definitely part of the social psychological environments that I found myself in. It was an incredible year, and I will never, in some ways, it was the most important year of my life, and I'll never forget it. And I'm sure that you probably had similar types of experiences living there. It's not a friendly place for travelers. And then it was even less friendly. Imagine this, right? Ulica Tverskaya, this big boulevard, lots of, stores and stuff on it now, probably cafes and nearby restaurants. In Moscow downtown in 1992, there was not a single cafe. There would have been like a stolovaya where you could have gotten some like bad soup. There was McDonald's. There were maybe a couple really high-end restaurants, and that was it. Oh, a Pizza Hut opened, which was a hole in the wall. You could get pizza. So it was a place that was really unfriendly to travelers and to just like being comfortable in public space, which I think is a feature of Soviet life. And so that was really hard, like as a traveler. I would go downtown and I would try to do stuff, and I would literally spend an hour every few days at McDonald's because at least I knew it was going to be warm in there and I could, spend some time writing. So a wild place to live at that period for sure.
It's great now because I have the touchscreen, so you can put it in English. So when you're tired from living in a different language all day, you can just go, thank you, McDonald's.
Yeah, and in fact, at that period, I mean, talk about the centrality of a cultural an icon. The ruble was sort of tagged to the price of a Big Mac. It was always $1, and so whatever the Big Mac was, that's how much you knew that the ruble was worth relative to the dollar.
That's super interesting.
Yeah.
I would agree. So this to me is one of the reasons I liked the poems that we read. He used the word duality earlier, and I kind of thought that was a good way on how I would describe what it was also like living in Russia. I mean, it wasn't 1992, but it still had that same kind of sense where, yeah, there were definitely aspects of it that were kind of cold and brutal, but then, you're walking through just a random market that you're stumbling upon, and it's all these old ladies trying to sell their honey, and they're like, oh, you're American, you have to try my honey. Okay, so now I'm trying like 8 different kinds of honey. Everyone's very interested in what I think about their country. They're like on the edge of their seats waiting for what I have to say. It was very interesting. So there's a sort of, like a warmth that permeates a lot of the people, but then the sort of, I don't know how to describe that other end of it is not so warm.
I'm interested that you had that experience of warmth because I don't think I did. Once you cracked someone, they're I don't know, someone described it as like coconut cultures that are really hard on the outside, but once you get a way in with someone, they'll give you anything. And Russia is a kind of a coconut culture in that sense. But I'm glad to hear that you had some like moments of real connection, because once you become friendly with a Russian, like you're friends for life,
Sure.
Yeah.
That was my experience.
Well, it's kind of funny that you mentioned that. My experience, like Russians were friendlier to us than they were to other Russians. Like Matt and I would be together and we'd be with like a Russian person that immediately to be very friendly. They're like, hey, you should do these things. And then someone else would come along and they'd almost like give them a death stare. It's like, they got weird vibes to them. We should talk. Like, it was always very interesting. But to kind of transition to the next question, it's funny that you mentioned, we've talked about being in 1992. I remember we talked to one teacher who was very fond of Americans, and she told us that she believed Americans and Russians are the most alike people in the world because she only met Americans one other time in 1992 in Yaroslavl, of all places, when some Americans came through and they met and they spent all night drinking whiskey, and she said they could keep up shot for shot, and that's why I know Americans and Russians are the most alike people in the world. So many questions about that. Why were they in Yaroslavl in 1992? But that's beside the point. And Matt and I experienced these, like, we talked about this duality. But
that was me, by the way. No, I'm just kidding. I was about to say Yaroslavl, but I don't remember drinking whiskey.
There's probably a picture of you up on the wall. We just, didn't realize.
It's not impossible. I don't think there were that many Americans there in 1992.
I think that did help for us. We were in places that people were like, why are you here? Like, it just would, it can kind of jar them for sure.
So, it's kind of on that trend in your introduction to Ochre and Rust, you talk about what many people get wrong about Russia, about really Eastern Europe on the whole, maybe even Central Asia, is that people are obsessed with misery, suffering, death. I mean, that's like the classic association with, Russian authors, right? And I would kind of want to, like, how do you, I guess there's a lot of ways to go with that. How do you think this has become so dominant? And also, it kind of seems like Gandlevsky resists this interpretation. In some ways, like, it engages with it, but it also is resistant to it. It's a much more lived experience. It's bohemian, it's outside, it's in it, it's of it, it's many things.
Totally. Russia has such a fascinating self-concept. It's almost as if Russians grow up with a sense that their culture is impenetrable to others. And so there's a certain measure of pride in the mystery of Russian culture for Russians. So it's a self-identification partly, but there's also the lens, the prism through which we view other cultures, we meaning we Americans, right? We're constantly viewing other cultures through stereotypical lens, whether we're looking at the Middle East, with Orientalism or Islamophobia or, whatever it is, right? There's or racism or whatever. That being said, Russians do have a cultural capacity for philosophical and existential thinking and existential wondering, which is so deeply attractive. I mean, it's part of the culture in a way that it's not for us. The Americans tend to be much more utilitarian, practical, in some of that, around sort of Calvinistic Protestantism is like feeling evasive and individualistic. And Russians are they offer almost a kind of binary to us in a sense. Like they're more collectivistic, they're more interested in the mystical, the irrational. They love to philosophically muse. Although there's a hard materialism to Russian culture, particularly now. I mean, it's definitely a capitalist country. There are enough things that certainly drew me in, and that I think are still typical of a certain kind of Russianness. These things always change. Like whenever we think we've essentially captured a culture, it shifts. And so I want to be very careful about not sort of relying on my, impressions over the years to sort of overdetermine what is a deeply complex culture and set of cultures, actually. That being said, one of my favorite memes, which I've happily shared, is that one that's 4 quadrants, right? And it's one is the American, I will die for freedom, right? And the French is, I will die for love. And then you have Dostoevsky. I forgot the other one. Dostoevsky is like, I will die. That seems to sort of capture something of the kind of primordial nature of what Russian literature seems to be interested in, which is like those ultimate things and facing them somehow.
I found there could be a link on that sort of self-deprecating humor. I find that translates well across couple different cultures.
Totally. Yeah. And so for Gandlevsky, I think that he draws upon some of those kind of cultural inheritances, but he's also playing with them in all sorts of ways. He is not in some ways, I think my first read through of him was that he was more of a romantic than I think he ultimately is. He's definitely ironic, and he employs lots of these tropes in fashions that show a little bit of distance, you know. So he sort of has one foot in both of those territories, the sort of total Dostoevskian embrace of, you know, the gloom and the mire and the misery and the suffering, and then this other foot, which is in a kind of quicksilver skepticism of that same modality, and a kind of also a kind of joyfulness, which I think really appears in the music of the poems. And so that's the thing that we don't get often as Americans, is that other sense. You know, of course, we have all these other stereotypes of Russians, but that's a kind of classic stereotype, the Dostoevskian sort of romantic type.
That's interesting. Sorry, Matt, if you don't mind if I break in here and break off your question for a second, because I wanted to follow up on that just briefly, because there's a line in the introduction that really caught me, especially because I went through and I read some poems before I went and read the introduction, and it brought something to life for me that I think I've been looking at but hadn't quite grasped, which is that you're right that anyone who's familiar with the Russian canon will notice that, you know, that Gandlevsky makes allusions, but it's not quite, you know, as you write, it does not politely invoke the great writers, but rather brings them alive to wrestle with their incomplete legacy. And I was kind of curious if you could expand on that, because that really caught my attention in talking about, especially when he makes those allusions. And what is it? I think it's something at the garage, and, you know, this coffin being brought forth like Prince Andrei on the field of Austerlitz. As soon as you said that, I couldn't stop noticing it.
Totally.
I guess I read that.
It makes me want to just read a couple lines.
Please.
Yeah, so I think that great writers do not simply rely on sort of symbolic allusions, but they sort of circle back to questions that writers maybe haven't fully addressed. Certainly, Tolstoy is a long-standing companion in the wrestle of literature, the dialogue of literature. For Gandlevsky, for a number of different reasons. One of which I think is that Tolstoy, certainly in the latter part of his career, his writing life, really embraced an idea of a faith that I think that Gandlevsky is haunted by and can't quite accede to. So so that one. I'm gonna read a couple lines from that poem, and then another one that comes out later on. So that poem. Long ago, we wandered in on the festival of death, pressing to our chest the aquarium of the things of sorrow. It's fairy tale scary to be at a burial concert, reflected in a brass trumpet as an upside down crowd. In March 1960, behind some garages, Jura drilled us on sexology and the science of curses. The audience thrilled. Suddenly above the floors, music kicked up. Something was carried in a coffin. Like Prince Andrei on the Austerlitz battlefield, I raised my face to the courtyard's rectangle of heaven. Blackbirds, three clouds, gray faces, old women howled as the little kids giggled. Childhood in March, the union of sparrow and willow, the meager courage of music, the senile din, hats off, eyes down, only the sky knows no sorrow, old organ grinder, coerce the hoarse organ. There's that famous scene, right, in War and Peace, right, Prince Andrei on the battlefield of Austerlitz, in which he kind of sees everything, sees sort of all of life. And he's totally employing this ironically, you know, almost parodically. Like, he is not like Prince Andrei on the battlefield of Austerlitz. He's at a funeral, a burial concert. But like so many Russians, he sees himself in the kind of living myth that Tolstoy has created. I mean, that's what Tolstoy was so good at. He was like the totalist. He was the one who was like God, who could sort of see everyone and see into their hearts, and with it, you know, one gesture could sort of describe anybody. Gandlevsky's world is very different than that, and it's much less grand and majestic. In fact, it's almost the opposite. And yet, you know, he wants to throw it in because he wants to make it maybe slightly more grand than it actually is. Let me stop there before I read the other one, because I know that you all have gone through War and Peace and stuff like that. Like how did it strike you, and that moment in Tolstoy?
Well, so the reason why it caught me so much is that it's so funny, because like I think, if I've mistaken this as the wrong battle, I apologize. But that's when Andre, that's when he's fallen on the battlefield. He sees Napoleon, and he's like, finally, this is the culmination of everything he wants. But as he's staring at Napoleon, all he can stare up is like this endless sky and all this meaning. And so it's this very grand moment of like coming to a realization about things. And we're focused on this similar sort of thing. Is like there's these people around, the narrator here, but also looking up at the sky. But instead of this grand, realization of the importance of things more than just like these obsessions, Napoleon, it's looking up at a couple birds, 3 clouds, some old people, right? It's like this sort of very funny, ironic, like this should be a moment of revelation, but it's really not. It's just like, it's kind of an empty sky, like everything else around them. This feeling of importance up against the reality that it's just kind of, I don't want to say it's just another day, but it kind of is. It's a moment which is sticking out clearly in this narrator's mind, but it's not sticking out, I don't know, maybe not because of grand revelation, but rather because of the lack of revelation, this childhood in March, this union of Sparrow and Willow, this time in between, the similar thing with Andre, where he's staring at that. I think it's a willow tree that he stares at, sees through several times, sees it either as like a dying tree or, young, yet to grow out, all these illusions, which are much less grand, but also because of their banality almost in a way, like they have the same sort of importance that, at least for me, when I look back on my childhood, I don't remember important things. I remember these small, random memories, which nonetheless kind of take on this import, is where I kind of walked away from that.
Yeah, I would, just tend to agree in general. I find Tolstoy kind of, I love him as a stylist and I love to read him, but I don't always find him, the most convincing in a lot of ways. It's almost like, reading an oxymoron in some senses, where his whole sort of, like you said, the god Tolstoy that seeks to almost, annihilate by detail. It doesn't work when he tries to grasp what is infinite, or what else can be there. And so I'm endlessly intrigued by other writers who approach this sort of hyper detalization in a similar way, but that sort of, to me, I always kind of think of it as sort of striving towards the infinite with detail. I am so obsessed with writers that do this. So this is why I enjoyed a lot of these poems. This is why my favorite writers tend to be people where other people find them just dense, boring, things like that. Not to be just contrarian, I actually do, tend to find it meaningful in a sort of different way, in a challenging way, but it's, different. And so that's why I like this strain of questioning, Cameron, on sort of wrestling with what it means to tackle these sort of incomplete questions is fun.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, in a sense, Gandlevsky's commitment to ordinary life precedes and sort of subsumes the transcendental questions about death, life and death and the infinite. And so his commitment is to the immanent, rather than transcendental. And, that doesn't mean that he's, I'm not trying to secretly say that his theology is, God is in, the ordinary things. I don't even know if he goes that far. I think he's more of a skeptic and agnostic than that. But those questions live with him and perturb him. But his commitment to, that kind of thick description of the ordinary is absolutely central. And it's a different kind of thick description than Tolstoy, who wants to sort of always penetrate or always, dimensionalize into the infinite. There's a late poem on page 96 where he references Tolstoy again directly. And it's a moment when his mother is passing away. His mother is like a figure of such great steadiness and fidelity and loyalty in his life, and in a sense, a kind of figure, a reminder of his own failures. So apparently, in Tolstoy, there's a line that he quotes at the beginning of this. The old prince is dying and calls for Andre. This phrase of Tolstoy torments me these days. But why? We're neither dukes nor counts, and yet the contours resemble my late mother's death. A morning like any other, sun shining. Get Sasha and Sergey, call Mark, my darling. She wailed in agony's thrall, died soon after. I'd like to question the transcendent author. What drives him to mount these wars on his own art, to batter our hearts, break beloveds apart? Either he means something, his words abandoned, or he has no control over what's happened. And so the author here, the transcendent author, is both Tolstoy and God, And so he sort of conflated them for the same reason that, that we all might,
Yeah. It's kind of funny talking about Gandlevsky's focus on like not just the simple, the banal everyday life, and conflating these grand themes, of previous authors in the canon of life, of God. But also, like, there are moments where I look in these poems, I'm like, oh, that's me. There's a poem, Check Out the City Slicker in Nature. I read that and I was like, oh no, that's when I go camping a couple times a year. I don't even know what these trees are. I just like, wow, this is nice, and conflating these kind of everyday rhymes with that. It was, beyond, there's many great directions to go with Gandlevsky, but recognizing oneself in that it happened more than I thought it was going to reading this collection.
That's awesome. I love that line too. Check out the city slicker in nature. He takes a week of unpaid leave, plays Pasternak in the parsnip patch, and waits at last for total peace. In Russian, pasternachit. He makes Pasternak's name into a verb, which is so cool. I think an original version I had was Pasternak's in a parsnip patch, but I wanted a little bit more of the rhythm there. So
that's super cool.
I don't know. This is one of the things that I just love about poetry in other languages, just learning about the different ways that poets will play, with their language. I'm not really sure what audience exists for learning about that, but I hope our audience at least finds this stuff interesting, because I don't know. I loved being able to do that when I was learning Russian. It felt so great when you finally could, sort of deduce your own verbs or words that kind of could make sense in context. And it just gave me such a greater appreciation when reading for just the creativity that exists within the language that is, I was saying to Cameron before this, just, it exists in English. It's just different. And it's not better or worse. It's just different. And it's hard to really describe without seeing it.
I suppose if I would, make a judgment, I would say that Russian is it's a richer language than English, richer and in its sort of profusion of words, but also in the ways in which the language itself is so flexible syntactically, the way in which you can make almost anything into a verb, as you say, and things like that. English is obviously a language, a lingua franca for the world because of American power. But I think it's also it's such a weirdly, sturdily practical language, utilitarian. I don't know.
Do you think that's why we've kind of thrown off and the constraints of meter, of rhyme, of everything, and just jumped into free verse so much earlier? Do you think that's what about Russian poetry allows it to sort of retain these classical elements? Because even nowadays, plenty of poets still write in, traditional meter. It's not weird. It's maybe probably even, more common, but in English, it's almost, I feel like, if somebody's still writing in some more traditional forms, I guess it would be like, they're really trying to work with it in a new way. Whereas in Russian, maybe not exactly. I don't know if that question makes sense, but
totally does. One of the things about English is that it came from Anglo-Saxon, and Anglo-Saxon had its own kind of repository of rhythmic structures and tricks, usually around alliterative verse, which meant it wasn't a kind of counting of syllables as much as it was or counting of metrical feet, but more like syllabic counts and use of highly alliterative kinds of structures. So the language isn't like Russian or Arabic for that matter, which has a kind of flexibility of syntax. You can sort of move things around the way that we used to in English a lot more. Like if you look back at Shakespeare and all those inversions of syntax, we tend to think those are just so artificial now that we would never do them. So English has its own tradition in relationship to what we might call quantitative verse. That is to say, like very regular meter. So for those of you who aren't really up on this stuff, whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though he will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. That kind of really regular beat that Frost might have in a poem like Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening. That kind of, Frost was one of the last ones in the modern period who would have been employing that. Frost and Hausman and a couple others. You have to go all the way. I mean, of course there are people throughout who are writing in verse, but the sort of the growing edge or the sort of most elevated writers were not ones writing in traditional verse in English. There's been some moments of return in our culture and tradition. Folks like Gwendolyn Brooks, and then the kind of new formalists who came around in the 80s and were writing atavistically, really saying like, this is what poetry should be like. We're going to go back to that because that's the kind of thing that people really like. People like rhyme, people actually do like meter. It's memorable. The Russian situation is so weird. I mean, relative to world poetry, other than perhaps Arabic, all European poetry like moved on from metrical verse with modernism. That is to say, early 20th century, kind of moved on. The Russians kept their beautiful music, orchestral music, as it is in poetry. And Gandlevsky may be the last generation that for whom it was expected. I think right now we have the first generation, like literally right now in the 21st century, 20 years in, 23 years in, where people are doing more, Verliber, free verse type things. But it's such an older kind of outlook. I asked Gandlevsky this question, and he called it patriarchal, but in that sense of kind of traditional. I think that the fact of the Soviet Union may have slowed down the sort of quote unquote capitalist innovations of literature. May have. I'm not 100% sure that's the case, but may have. But I think what's retained is something that we've kind of lost, except it's kind of returned in oral poetry, like hip hop and song lyrics and things like that. So I think that there are gifts that both traditions provide, but it definitely makes it harder to translate because then you're trying to sort of bring two things together and need a lot of very flexible approaches.
I just thought that was interesting when you were, talking about initially trying to avoid rhyme or, super direct rhyme. And it just, as a sort of technical feature of translation, that always makes me think that, wow, I would not be good at this because just the amount of considerations that go into how do I translate something that's, so beautiful in its original language and try to maintain that beauty in a completely different language where there's not only just, not even just the formal set of rules of translation, but then, oh, well, we don't do this like this anymore. This is not how poetry, works now, which of course you would know writing your own poetry. So that's why I value getting kind of, your insight on that. I find it very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, there are plenty of really powerful writers right now writing what we would call verse, like in metrical forms and with rhyme. But when I started doing this, there were fewer, certainly. And
sure.
Yeah, I mean, poetry is like this weird thing. It's just such a niche cultural activity that you can basically find anybody doing anything at any time. And the idea that somehow there's like a totally dominant force is maybe just less necessary than it is, say, in politics or business or something.
Sure.
I know we're kind of getting towards the end of some of the questions we wanted to ask you. We kind of wanted to finish off on sort of a question from the other book that you sent us, A Kindred Orphanhood, which we, fortunately, there's so much to talk about. We didn't have as much time to get to that one, which is another poetry collection of Gandlevsky you mentioned. There are a few references to his poetry operating in a sort of an anti-imperial mode of sorts. And as we're kind of talking about, the Soviet era that Gandlevsky is writing in for a lot of this, although of course not all. Gandlevsky is still continues writing on after this to today. How does Gandlevsky navigate the periphery of Soviet empire in his poetry?
Well, I think first as a traveler, and like many writers before him, he was a restless person who found, the power centers to be suffocating in certain ways. And, that Pushkin, traveled all over the place. And some of these folks were exiled. So they actually got to see, like Dostoevsky and many others were exiled to Siberia. So Gandlevsky, as a sort of roving, desiring, hungering bohemian, wanted to escape, life in the capital, and found himself in all sorts of far reaches. And you can see all sorts of references to the periphery of the Soviet empire, places that I had no idea. Like, what is this? Alushta. Where is Alushta? Alushta. I don't know, where is Alushta. So I kept having to look things up on maps because he was constantly referring to them. In a way, I suppose the least charitable way you can talk about these is sort of exoticism. Like, I'm going to throw Alushta in this poem. I'm going to throw some, the Black Sea, or I'm going to throw something in that's going to be non-Moscow centric. But I think that there's also a desire constantly to militate against the idea of centralization, of the power center, of sort of observing the periphery and sort of being in peripheral spaces, not being in spaces of power. And just as a kind of literal, kind of autobiographical parallel to that, Gandlevsky now is living in Tbilisi in the Republic of Georgia, precisely because he and his family felt vulnerable after the invasion in Ukraine. That he didn't want to be separated from his son and his daughter. His son has got, family, his own little family. And so they all just relocated to the periphery. And I think that kind of demonstrates something of his, his ethic. He's not a dissident in any kind of classical sense, but he is someone who is a writer of conscience, who does not assent to being used as a plaything of power. And just like another anecdote on that level, he won a fairly big prize. Probably would have been about $30,000 or $40,000 of today's money. But the guy who was putting up the money had some kind of conditions. They wanted him to do this or that, the other thing. And he's like, I'm nobody's monkey, like he refused the money. Even though he absolutely could have used the money, he did not want to be anybody's plaything, a plaything of power. And I totally respect that. And so although he's not, on the front lines, leading charges, his dignity is intact in terms of what he feels is ethically right in the situation. So life is complex. And one of the things that I recognized as I was, translating this and thinking about the Ukraine situation is that I remember I had the opportunity to go to Ukraine when I was in Russia, but it was, they required a separate visa, and I thought, like, this is too complicated. Like, why are they making me? But of course, they required a separate visa because they felt that they were their own place. And me, being this arrogant guy who had totally drunk the Russian Kool-Aid, thought, oh, Ukraine, it's just the borderlands, It's like, what's so special about that? And so I did not know and understand the history of like Holodomor and the sort of things that what a minority country would have faced vis-a-vis Russia. And so there's always in Russian literature a kind of imperial temperament, which is part of being part of a country as big as 1/6 of the world as the Soviet Union was. At the same time that Russians inside of that tradition sometimes are able to see the limits of that kind of expansionist imperial kind of idea, and to really notice and observe the world and its complexity, and to try not to fit everything into a kind of Russianness. I think you had a similar experience as you've sort of developed the podcast in terms of thinking of its name and the role that you can play in terms of the wider cultural question of Slavic and Eastern European literature and culture. The last thing I would just say about all of that is that I got so obsessed with Tolstoy at some point and read just about everything that he did. He has a very late book called Haji Murat, which is about this warrior from one of the Caucasus tribes. I can't remember which one now, Caucasus peoples. And it's a very powerful, simple and powerful book in which he totally ascribes a kind of dignity to a person who probably 20 years before when he was writing, or, most people in the society would believe is a terrorist, and he says, no, this is a person who's coming from a culture and has a kind of dignity that an approach to life, which I want to understand and want to write into. And that's the book Haji Murat. So I'm always interested in those moments when a culture can sort of overcome its own ideas of its own centrality and sort of really see what else is happening in the world. No, and I think Gandlevsky at moments kind of has that kind of humility and opens us up to sort of thinking outside of what's the typical.
Yeah, I think so. I know we're trying to wrap up, but yeah, as you're saying that, I can't help but think about, Pushkin, the Captain's Daughter, a piece I've never been able to stop thinking about ever since I read it. But exactly what you're saying, that there are many authors who so interestingly write, often from a place of power, both Tolstoy, Pushkin, and less so Gandlevsky, obviously, who are able to engage with like the peripheries and people on the periphery of like, in the Captain's Daughter, almost romanticizing, our not a false Dimitri, but the leader of the rebellion, and the same for Haji Murat. It's so interesting to see that almost being overcome in many ways, but also the kind of not, I guess, an inverse, but the corollary where we talk about writers like Gandlevsky, writers who in the modern era, some especially with the I guess you could say definitely could say there's a polarization of politics, but even writers we've covered on this podcast who 20 years ago all would be considered maybe not dissident writers, but Zakhar Prilipin 20 years ago to today, his position has changed drastically. So seeing, as you're talking about, writers who maintain their dignity, I don't necessarily want to say Prilipin necessarily had dignity back in the day. That's not really, but like writers who are writing against the government, and to today, where that's developed, where they've gone politically as artists, is fascinating to watch. Yeah, so this has been interesting to talk about.
Well, I've been absolutely delighted by this conversation. In fact, like you actually said some things about the sort of the use of Tolstoy that I had not totally, I'd sort of understood instinctively, but I hadn't, I've not written a paper on it or anything. So it really kind of excited me to sort of get to another layer of thinking about the Gandlevsky stuff. So I hope that hope you were as equally pleased by the sort of some of these discoveries.
I was. This happens to me all the time in the podcast. I don't always come in with fully formed thoughts, and sometimes I'm just kind of finding it as I go along, and it's always really fun.
Well, Philip, thank you so much for being here today. Usually when we finish up, we just ask, is there anything you think people should look forward to coming out that you're working on? Anything to look forward to on your end?
Oh my gosh. I mean, I would be thrilled if people, got a copy of this book, Ochre Rust.
Yeah.
I have a book of my own poems coming out next year, but this being a Slavic podcast, I think let's keep our focus on this stuff. Yeah, for sure. I think that there's some marvels in this book, and some, even if people don't like poems, there are some poems in here that you'll be pleased by. Here's just a very short one. Like at the sort of end of his life, he did a little bit more of a hip hoppy type structure, and I wanted to try to get as close to that. And there's a sort of goodbye in here, which might be someone who's in a coffin. We don't know, but it goes, under my breath, I mutter a swear and head down the stair. To the chubby girl on the ascent, I wink and sway like a bear. No doubt in the descent, something weighs on the mind like cement. Why drink without a thing to eat? That's what makes a Russian complete. The sun hides beneath the mist. Spot chases after his missus. An old lady scolds her granddaughter. Wave bye to the nice man, dear. You got to hear this one in Russian. It's really funny. It's really funny.
I would say for anyone that's on the fence concerned, I'm not going to get the illusions. I'm not going to get what it's all about. This was so helpful, the notes section in the back. Even for myself, I would consider myself fairly well-versed, maybe more than the average person in Russian poetry. It's not my particular area of expertise, but there were so many things that I was totally going to overlook and was absolutely going to miss without this. So that was critically helpful. I supremely dislike getting books with no commentary. I very much want commentary.
Cool. Very much a shout out to my friend Dmitry Shortsev, who really helped walk me through some of that kind of back end illusions that I hadn't discovered yet. So
there's just so much. It's such a rich and dense really tradition. So it's super, super helpful.
For sure. All right. Thanks, you too.
Awesome, Philip. Thank you so much for being here today.
Absolutely.
And before we let you go, we just want to let you know that next week we're going to be releasing our first full, technically, episode on Vasily Grossman's Life and Fate, which will be covering Part 1, Chapters 1 through 31. So if you aren't already part of our chapter a day read-along, really easy. These are not long chapters. You can go to our website, sign up for our listserv. On there, we'll be sending you an email every morning with an analysis of that chapter. We'll be having discussions on it in our social media and on Discord. And then each night we'll be recording a podcast, as you've probably seen, recapping what people had to say that day. And it's been a lot of fun so far, so we highly encourage you to sign up if you have the time. It's really not a huge commitment. But to help keep our show independent and for exclusive access to notes containing all the research that went into this episode, you can head on over to our website, slaviclitpod.com. Before we let you go, we wanted to extend a sincere thank you to all of our current supporters: Juliana, Diane, Oleg, John, Timex, Melissa, Baron, Vaughn, Aldo, Ben, Gabe, George, Claire, Amy, Allie, Soraya, Jackson, Molly, Emma, Mike, Marianne, Mickey, Eric, Mike, Peter, Eric, Ben, Claire, Jeff, Inez, Mai, Robert, Joseph, Daniel, Lou, Nina, Gary, Janice, Mary, Anne, Isaac, Amanda, Caitlin, Yitza, Irini, and Pack Rob. The music used in this episode, as always, is Staraya Kino by Peremotka. You can find more of their stuff on Bandcamp or Spotify. The links and spelling are in the show notes. You'll hear from us again soon.